Tears glistened on Abigail Lawson's cheeks as she stood trembling in the center of the busy trading post, her accusations falling on deaf ears while the men of Lovelock, Nevada Territory, continued about their business as if she were nothing more than an annoying insect buzzing in their ears. It was 1876, and in this dusty frontier town nestled between the Humboldt Mountains and the vast desert plains, a woman's word meant little against a man of standing, especially when that man was Theodore Harrington, the wealthiest rancher for 100 miles. "Please," Abigail begged, her voice cracking as she clutched her tattered shawl around her shoulders. At 22, she had already weathered more hardship than most women twice her age. "He stole my father's land. I have the papers to prove it." Caleb Wilson, the storekeeper, merely shook his head. "Miss Lawson, we've heard enough of this. Your father lost that property fair and square in that poker game. Everyone knows it." "That's not true," Abigail's voice rose. "My father never gambled. Mr. Harrington forged those documents after my father died. The real deed is in my possession." The afternoon sunlight streamed through the dusty windows of the trading post, illuminating the faces of the men who studiously avoided meeting her gaze. Some shuffled uncomfortably, but none dared challenge the established story, not when Harrington controlled the cattle routes and owned the bank that held most of their mortgages. "Your tears ain't gonna change facts, miss," said Sheriff Dawson, thumbs hooked in his belt loops. "Now I suggest you get on home before you cause any more of a scene." Abigail felt her cheeks burn with humiliation and anger. Her father had worked that land for 15 years, building it from nothing into a respectable small ranch. After he died from pneumonia 3 months ago, she'd returned from her teaching position in Sacramento to find Harrington's men already moving onto the property, claiming her father had wagered and lost it weeks before his death. "I will not be silenced," she said, her voice steadier now despite the tears that continued to fall. "My father was murdered. He was poisoned, and then Harrington stole everything we had. Someone in this town must have the courage to stand up for the truth." A hush fell over the trading post. The accusation of murder was far more serious than claims of document forgery. Even Sheriff Dawson seemed taken aback. "That's a dangerous claim, Miss Lawson," the sheriff warned. "Mr. Harrington is a respected citizen. Unless you have proof of such allegations, I'd advise you to keep such thoughts to yourself." "Or what?" Abigail challenged. "Will I meet the same fate as my father?" The uncomfortable silence was broken by the sound of spurs jangling against floorboards. The crowd parted as a tall figure moved through them, and for the first time, Abigail noticed the stranger standing in the shadows at the back of the store. He stepped forward now, his movements deliberate and measured. He wasn't like the other men of Lovelock. His clothes were trail-worn but well-kept dark trousers tucked into dusty boots, a navy blue shirt rolled at the sleeves revealing tanned, muscular forearms, and a black Stetson pulled low over his eyes. A revolver hung at his hip, worn but well-maintained. He wasn't flashy like a gunslinger, but there was something in his bearing that commanded attention. "Seems to me," the stranger said, his voice deep and quiet, yet somehow filling the room, "that when a lady cries like that, there's usually good reason." Sheriff Dawson's expression hardened. "This ain't your business, stranger." The man stepped closer, and Abigail could see his face clearly now. He was perhaps 30, with sun-weathered skin that spoke of years under the open sky. His eyes were a piercing blue, direct and unflinching. A scar ran along his jawline, disappearing into the shadow of a neatly trimmed beard. "Name's Jake Quinn," he said, removing his hat and holding it respectfully against his chest. "Just rode in from Colorado Territory, and I've found that in most towns, Justice is everybody's business. Abigail felt a flutter of something unfamiliar in her chest, not quite hope, but perhaps its distant cousin. "Mr. Quinn," Sheriff Dawson's voice carried a warning, "Lovelock handles its own affairs. Miss Lawson here has been making these claims for weeks now, with nothing to back them up but her tears and wild stories." Jake's eyes never left Abigail's face. "Is that so?" He addressed her directly, not the sheriff. "Madam, would you mind telling me what happened, the whole story?" The simple act of being asked of someone actually wanting to hear her nearly undid Abigail completely. She swallowed hard and straightened her shoulders. "My father, Samuel Lawson, owned a small ranch about 5 miles east of town. He built it himself after coming here in '61. 3 months ago, he wrote me saying he was concerned about some threats he'd received from Mr. Harrington, who wanted our water rights. 2 weeks later, I received word he'd died suddenly." Abigail's voice trembled but remained clear. "When I arrived home for the funeral, Harrington's men were already on our property, claiming my father had lost it in a poker game the night before he died." She reached into her pocket and withdrew a folded document. "This is the original deed to our land in my father's name, with my name added last year when I turned 21. My father kept it in a locked box. The only reason Harrington didn't get it was because I had the key with me in Sacramento." Jake nodded slowly. "And the alleged gambling debt?" "My father never gambled a day in his life. He was a God-fearing man who considered cards and dice tools of the devil. Everyone in this town knows that." Abigail's eyes swept the room accusingly. "And he was healthy as a horse until the day he supposedly drank himself into a stupor and died. The doctor called it heart failure, but refused to look at the strange color of his lips or the way his fingernails had turned blue." Jake considered this information, then turned to face the crowd. "Sounds to me like these are serious allegations that deserve proper investigation." A harsh laugh cut through the tension. Theodore Harrington stood in the doorway of the trading post, flanked by 2 of his ranch hands. In his 50s, Harrington was an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with a silver beard and cold eyes that had seen the worst of the frontier and participated in much of it. "Investigation's already been done, Cowboy," Harrington said dismissively. Sheriff Dawson here satisfied himself that everything was above board. The girl's just distraught with grief, making up stories because she can't accept that her precious daddy had vices like any other man. Jake didn't respond to Harrington directly. Instead, he turned back to Abigail. "Miss Lawson, do you have somewhere safe to stay tonight?" The question caught her off guard. For weeks, she'd been sleeping in the back room of the schoolhouse where she'd secured a position teaching the town's children. The previous teacher had left abruptly after Harrington's youngest son had broken her wrist in a misunderstanding. "I manage," she said stiffly, unwilling to reveal her vulnerability in front of Harrington. Jake nodded as if he understood exactly what she wasn't saying. "I see." He turned to address the room at large. "Gentlemen, I believe you all owe this lady your attention. If what she says has merit, a grave injustice has been done. And if it doesn't, well, what's the harm in listening?" "The harm," Harrington cut in, "is that she's slandering a respected businessman and wasting everyone's time with her hysterics." Jake's expression didn't change, but something cold flashed in his eyes. "Hysterics? Is that what you call it when someone fights for their rightful property?" "I call it the desperate flailing of a woman who doesn't know her place," Harrington shot back. The trading post had grown crowded as word spread about the confrontation. Nearly every man in Lovelock had gathered to watch the exchange between the newcomer and the town's most powerful resident. Abigail noticed that many of the men couldn't even look in her direction, whether from shame or fear. She couldn't tell. "Well then," Jake said, his voice deceptively casual as he replaced his hat. "Perhaps what's needed here is for every man to look this lady in the eye and tell her to her face that they don't believe her. That they think she's lying about her father's character, about his death, about the theft of her land." He paused, letting the challenge sink in. "Because where I come from, a man stands by his convictions. He doesn't hide behind others or look at his boots when hard truths are spoken." An uncomfortable murmur rippled through the crowd. Harrington's face darkened with anger. "You're new here, Quinn. You don't know how things work in Lovelock," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "I know how things should work everywhere," Jake replied, "with honesty and respect." He turned to address the gathered townspeople. "So which of you fine gentlemen wants to be first? Step right up and look Miss Lawson in the eye. Tell her you think she's lying about her father." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Caleb Wilson, the storekeeper, stepped forward hesitantly. He was a thin man with nervous hands that never seemed to stop moving. He stood before Abigail, opened his mouth, then closed it again. His eyes darted to Harrington, then back to Abigail's tear-stained face. "Miss Lawson, he began, then faltered. "Go on," Jake encouraged. "Tell her what you really believe." Caleb swallowed hard. "Miss Lawson, your father was a good customer, paid his bills on time, never saw him touch a drop or play cards, not once in 15 years. He glanced fearfully at Harrington. "That's all I can say." It wasn't much, but it was more support than Abigail had received in weeks. She nodded gratefully to Caleb, who quickly stepped back into the crowd, avoiding Harrington's furious gaze. "Anyone else?" Jake asked, his voice carrying the challenge to every corner of the room. One by one, men stepped forward. Some could barely meet her gaze, mumbling non-committal statements before retreating. Others found more courage, admitting they'd found the circumstances of Samuel Lawson's death and the transfer of his property suspicious. A few even confessed they'd heard Harrington boasting about finally getting that stubborn old fool's water rights, just days before Samuel's death. With each testimony, Abigail stood taller, her tears drying on her cheeks as vindication slowly dawned. The fear that had held the town in its grip was beginning to crack under the steady gaze of this stranger who demanded accountability. Sheriff Dawson watched with growing unease as the tide of public opinion visibly shifted. He'd been in Harrington's pocket for years, looking the other way when the rancher's methods crossed legal lines. But this was different. Murder was something even he couldn't ignore if enough people started asking questions. "That's enough of this circus," Harrington finally barked, his face mottled with rage. He turned to his men. "Dawkins, Fisher, escort Mr. Quinn to the edge of town. Make sure he understands that Lovelock doesn't welcome troublemakers." The two ranch hands moved forward, hands hovering near their pistols. Jake didn't reach for his own weapon, but something in his posture changed, a subtle shift that nonetheless radiated danger. "I wouldn't," he said softly. "Not unless you're prepared for what comes after." The ranch hands hesitated, sensing something in Jake's demeanor that gave them pause. They looked to Harrington for further instruction. "Sheriff," Harrington demanded, "arrest this man for disturbing the peace. And the Lawson girl, too, for her slanderous accusations." Sheriff Dawson shifted uncomfortably. "Now, Theodore, I can't arrest folks just for talking. The girl hasn't done anything illegal and neither has Quinn here." "Are you defying me?" Harrington asked incredulously. The sheriff looked around at the gathered townspeople, many of whom were now watching him with newfound scrutiny. "I'm upholding the law," he said carefully, "and the law says people can speak their minds, even in Lovelock." Harrington's face contorted with fury. "You'll regret this, all of you." His eyes burned with particular hatred as they fixed on Abigail. Especially you, girl." With that, he stormed out of the trading post, his men following in his wake. A collective breath seemed to be released as the door slammed behind him. People began to speak all at once, the trading post buzzing with the most animated conversation Lovelock had heard in years. Jake turned to Abigail. "Miss Lawson, I think you've made your point for today. Would you allow me to escort you somewhere safe?" "I suspect Mr. Harrington isn't finished expressing his displeasure." Abigail nodded, suddenly exhausted now that the adrenaline of the confrontation was fading. "The schoolhouse is at the end of the street. I've been staying there." As they stepped outside onto Lovelock's Main Street, the setting sun cast long shadows across the dusty thoroughfare. Several townspeople nodded respectfully to Abigail as they passed, acknowledgments that would have been unthinkable just hours before. "Mr. Quinn," Abigail said quietly as they walked, "I don't know how to thank you. No one has stood up for me like that since my father died." Jake glanced down at her, his expression softening slightly. "No thanks necessary, Miss Lawson. I've seen what happens when good people stay silent in the face of injustice. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to ask the hard questions." "Why did you?" she asked. "You don't know me. You have no stake in any of this." He was silent for several steps before answering. "Let's just say I recognize the look of someone fighting a battle they shouldn't have to fight alone." They reached the small schoolhouse as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the mountains. The building was modest, a single room with a small attached living space at the back. Abigail unlocked the door with a key from her pocket. "It's not much," she said apologetically, lighting a lamp that cast a warm glow over the sparse furnishings. A narrow cot, a small table with a single chair, and a trunk containing her few possessions were all she had in the world now. "It's secure enough for tonight," Jake said, examining the locks on the doors and windows. "But Harrington strikes me as a man who doesn't give up easily. You should be prepared for him to retaliate." "He's already taken everything from me," Abigail said bitterly. "What more can he do?" Jake's expression was grave. "A man like that, with his pride wounded publicly, he can do a great deal more." Abigail sank onto the edge of her cot, the weight of her situation settling on her shoulders once again. "What am I supposed to do? I have no money to hire a lawyer." "The territorial courts are a 3-day ride away in Carson City, and even if I could get there, Harrington has friends in the territorial government." Jake leaned against the wall, thinking. "First thing tomorrow, we gather whatever evidence you have of your father's ownership. The deed, any correspondence, business records, anything that proves the timeline of events. Then we start asking more questions around town." He paused. "You mentioned your father wrote to you about threats. You still have those letters?" Abigail nodded and moved to the trunk at the foot of her cot. She unlocked it and withdrew a small bundle of letters tied with string. "Here," she said, handing them to Jake. "The last 3 mention Harrington specifically." Jake took the letters and moved closer to the lamp to read them. His expression grew increasingly grim as he worked his way through Samuel Lawson's neat handwriting, detailing escalating pressure from Harrington to sell his water rights and threats when he refused. "Your father seemed like a careful man," Jake noted, refolding the letters. "He documented everything. Did he keep a journal or a ledger?" "He did," Abigail confirmed. "But it was in his desk at the ranch. I'm sure Harrington has destroyed it by now." Jake handed the letters back to her. "Maybe, maybe not. Men like Harrington often keep evidence of their misdeeds, thinking no one will ever be able to touch them." He straightened up and moved toward the door. "Get some rest, Miss Lawson. I'll be nearby tonight." "Mr. Quinn," Abigail called as he reached for the doorknob, "where will you stay?" A faint smile crossed his face. I've spent most of the last decade sleeping under the stars, Miss Lawson. The hotel across the street will feel like a palace." He tipped his hat and slipped out into the night, closing the door firmly behind him. Alone, Abigail allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope for the first time since receiving the news of her father's death. She didn't know who Jake Quinn was or why he'd chosen to help her, but something told her he wasn't a man who made promises lightly. And while she'd learned the hard way not to trust easily, there was something in his steady gaze and quiet confidence that made her believe that perhaps, just perhaps, justice might be possible after all. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the sky a vast blue canvas stretching over the Nevada desert. Abigail woke early, as was her habit, and prepared for the school day ahead. The children of Lovelock would arrive at 8 o'clock sharp, and regardless of her personal troubles, she took her responsibilities as their teacher seriously. She was arranging primers on the students' desks when a knock came at the schoolhouse door. Jake stood on the threshold, his hat in his hands, looking as if he'd already been awake for hours. "Good morning, Miss Lawson," he said. "I hope you slept well." "Well enough," she replied, though in truth she had tossed and turned much of the night, her mind racing with possibilities and fears. "The children will be arriving soon." Jake nodded. "I understand. I won't keep you long. I wanted to let you know I've been asking some questions around town this morning. The blacksmith remembered shoeing your father's horse just 2 days before he died. Said Samuel was in good spirits, making plans to repair his north fence the following week." "That sounds like my father," Abigail said softly. "Always planning ahead." "Not the behavior of a man about to gamble away his life's work," Jake observed. "I also spoke with the doctor who pronounced your father's death. Dr. Simmons, I believe." Abigail's expression darkened. "He's another one in Harrington's pocket. He barely examined my father before declaring it heart failure." "So he claimed," Jake agreed. "But he seemed nervous when I pressed him on the details, particularly when I mentioned the blue discoloration you observed." The sound of children's voices approaching the schoolhouse ended their conversation. Jake stepped back. "I'll continue my inquiries while you teach. We'll speak later." Throughout the day, Abigail found her attention divided between her lessons and thoughts of Jake Quinn. Who was this man who had ridden into Lovelock and immediately taken up her cause? He carried himself like someone accustomed to authority, yet he had mentioned spending years on the trail. There was something in his eyes, a shadow of past pain, perhaps that resonated with her own grief. When school dismissed at 3 o'clock, Abigail was surprised to find not only Jake waiting outside but also a small group of townspeople. She recognized Mrs. Peterson, the widow who ran the boarding house, Tom Farley, the blacksmith, and Eliza Barnes, who owned the town's only restaurant. "Miss Lawson," Mrs. Peterson said, stepping forward. "We've been talking with Mr. Quinn here, and we've decided it's time to set things right in Lovelock." Abigail looked at the group in astonishment. "What do you mean?" Tom Farley cleared his throat. "Your pa was a good man, never missed a payment, always dealt straight. When he died so sudden-like, and then Harrington moved in before he was barely cold in the ground, well, it didn't sit right with a lot of us. But Harrington's got ways of making life difficult for folks who cross him. But you're willing to cross him now?" Abigail asked, hope and skepticism warring in her voice. Eliza Barnes nodded firmly. "That display in the trading post yesterday got people talking. Really talking for the first time in years. Turns out most of us have been thinking the same things but were too afraid to say them out loud." Jake stood slightly apart, watching the exchange with quiet satisfaction. "Miss Lawson," he said, "I believe these good people have some information that might help your cause." Over the next hour, as they gathered in Eliza's restaurant after the dinner rush, Abigail listened in growing amazement as one person after another shared pieces of a puzzle that, when assembled, painted a damning picture of Theodore Harrington. His manipulation of land records, intimidation of smaller ranchers, and suspected involvement in at least 2 other mysterious deaths over the years emerged from their collective testimony. "The problem has always been proof," Tom Farley explained. "Harrington's careful, and he's got Judge Wilson over in Carson City in his back pocket. But if enough people are willing to testify," Jake countered, "and if we can find concrete evidence of forgery or poisoning in Samuel Lawson's case, not even a corrupt judge can ignore it." "There's another option, Mrs. Peterson said hesitantly. "The federal marshal is due to pass through next week. He answers to the U.S. government, not the territorial authorities. If we could present our case to him." Jake's eyes lit with interest. "That's exactly the kind of opportunity we need. In the meantime, we should try to gather as much evidence as possible." He turned to Abigail. "The most compelling proof would be anything from your father's desk at the ranch, his ledger, correspondence, any documentation of his dispute with Harrington." "But how can I get to the ranch?" Abigail asked. "Harrington's men are there, and they've made it clear I'm not welcome." A slow smile spread across Jake's face. "They're expecting you to come through the main gate, Miss Lawson." "But I'm guessing a girl raised on a ranch knows every inch of her father's property, including ways in that strangers might not watch so closely." Hope flared in Abigail's chest. "There's a creek bed that runs along the eastern property line. It's dry most of the year, but it creates a natural gully that leads almost to the back of the house. My father and I used to use it when tracking coyotes that were after our chickens." "Perfect," Jake said. "Tonight, after dark, we'll pay a visit to your ranch and reclaim what rightfully belongs to you." The group dispersed as evening fell, each person sworn to secrecy about their plans. Harrington had eyes and ears throughout Lovelock, and the element of surprise was their greatest advantage. As Abigail waited in her small room behind the schoolhouse for Jake to return, she found herself reflecting on how much had changed in just 24 hours. Yesterday, she had been alone in her grief and her quest for justice. Today, she had allies, and more importantly, she had Jake Quinn. She couldn't deny that there was something about the quiet cowboy that drew her to him. It wasn't just gratitude for his help, though that was certainly part of it. There was an integrity about him, a steadfastness that reminded her of her father. And when he looked at her, she felt truly seen in a way she hadn't experienced since before her father's death. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Jake stood outside, dressed entirely in dark clothing, his pistol at his hip and a rifle in his hand. "Are you ready?" he asked. Abigail nodded, pulling a dark shawl over her own dark dress. "Yes, I've been ready for this since the day they took my home." They slipped out of town on foot, avoiding the main road in favor of a game trail that wound through the sagebrush toward the east. The moon was just a sliver in the sky, providing enough light to see by without illuminating them to any watchful eyes. "How long have you been teaching?" Jake asked as they walked, his voice low. The unexpected question momentarily caught Abigail off guard. "Almost 2 years. I went to the normal school in Sacramento when I was 19. My father was so proud when I earned my teaching certificate." "He had reason to be," Jake said. "Not many young women from frontier towns manage that." "My father believed in education," Abigail explained, warming to the subject despite their tense mission. "He taught me to read before I was 5 and saved for years to send me to school. He always said knowledge was the one thing no one could take from you." Jake was quiet for a moment. "He sounds like a wise man." "He was," Abigail confirmed, swallowing the lump that rose in her throat. What about your family, Mr. Quinn? Do they know you've become a champion for distressed school teachers in Nevada? A shadow crossed Jake's face, visible even in the dim moonlight. My parents died in a Comanche raid when I was 14. My younger sister and I were taken in by neighbors, but it wasn't ideal. I left at 16, lied about my age to join the Union Army, fought the last 2 years of the war, then drifted west afterward. I'm sorry, Abigail said softly. About your parents, Jake shrugged, the gesture barely visible in the darkness. It was a long time ago. My sister's married now, living in St. Louis with a good man. I check in on her when I can. They continued in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. After about an hour of steady walking, Abigail touched Jake's arm. We're close, she whispered. The creek bed is just beyond that rise. They crested the small hill and found themselves looking down at the Lawson ranch spread out below them in the moonlight. The main house was a solid 2-story structure with a wide porch, built by Samuel Lawson's own hands and expanded over the years as his fortunes improved. A lamp burned in one of the downstairs windows, indicating someone was still awake. That was my father's study, Abigail said, pointing to the illuminated window. That's where his desk is, where we need to go. Jake surveyed the property carefully. I can see 2 men on the porch, probably more inside. We'll need to be very careful. He turned to Abigail. Show me this creek bed approach. They made their way down to the dry creek, which cut a path through the earth about 4 feet deep, enough to conceal them as they moved closer to the house. They crouched low, moving silently through the darkness, freezing whenever voices carried to them on the night air. Harrington's coming by tomorrow, one voice said as they drew near the back of the house. Says he wants to make sure everything's ready for the new cattle arriving next week. Don't know why he's in such an all-fired hurry, another voice replied. The old man's barely been dead 3 months. You know the boss. Never lets grass grow under his feet, especially when there's water rights involved. The voices faded as the men moved away from the back of the house. Jake motioned for Abigail to follow him as they slipped from the creek bed and darted across the open yard to the shadow of the house. They pressed themselves against the wall, listening intently for any sound of alarm. The study window, Abigail whispered, pointing to a dark window about 10 feet away. It should be unlocked. My father always left it open a crack for air circulation. They edged along the wall until they reached the window. Jake tested it gently, and to their relief, it slid open with minimal resistance. He helped Abigail through first, then followed her into the darkened study. The room smelled of tobacco and leather, scents so strongly associated with her father that Abigail felt tears spring to her eyes. She blinked them away, focusing on the task at hand. The massive oak desk still dominated the center of the room, its surface now cluttered with papers that hadn't been there during her father's meticulously organized lifetime. We need to hurry, Jake whispered, moving to stand guard at the study door while Abigail went straight to the desk. She opened drawers quietly but urgently, searching for her father's leather-bound ledger. It wasn't in its usual place in the center drawer. Panic began to rise in her throat as she searched drawer after drawer without success. It's not here, she whispered desperately to Jake. They must have taken it or destroyed it. Think, Jake urged. Would your father have had a hiding place, somewhere he kept important things? Abigail closed her eyes, trying to recall her father's habits. The bookcase, she suddenly remembered. Behind Pilgrim's Progress, he had a small compartment built into the wall. She moved quickly to the bookshelf that lined one wall of the study, her fingers finding the worn spine of her father's favorite book. She removed it carefully and reached into the space behind, her heart leaping when her fingers touched leather. I found it, she whispered triumphantly, withdrawing not only the ledger but also a small packet of letters tied with string. And more letters from Harrington. Jake nodded approvingly. Anything else we should take while we're here? Abigail hesitated, her eyes moving to a small portrait on her father's desk, herself at 18, just before leaving for Sacramento. Just that picture if we can. It's the only one I have of myself with my father. Jake carefully took the framed photograph and tucked it inside his shirt. Now let's get out of here before the sound of approaching footsteps in the hallway cut him off mid-sentence. He motioned urgently toward the window as the footsteps stopped outside the study door. Abigail clutched the ledger and letters to her chest, frozen in fear as the doorknob began to turn. In one fluid motion, Jake extinguished the small lamp they'd lit, plunging the room into darkness just as the door began to open. He grabbed Abigail's arm and pulled her behind the heavy curtains next to the window, his body shielding hers as they pressed against the wall. "Thought I heard something in here," a gruff voice said from the doorway. A beam of light from a lantern swept across the room, passing within inches of their hiding place. "Probably just the wind," another voice replied from the hallway. "This old house creaks like an arthritic mule." "Maybe," the first man said, sounding unconvinced. "But Harrington'll have our hides if anyone's been poking around in here." The lantern light moved closer to the desk. Abigail could feel Jake's heart pounding against her back, his breath warm against her hair as they stood motionless behind the heavy fabric. "Hey, where's that picture that was on the desk? The one of old Lawson and his daughter." Abigail's heart sank. They'd noticed the missing photograph. Next to her, she felt Jake's hand move slowly toward his pistol. "Harrington probably took it," the second man said dismissively. "Said something about having leverage over the girl if she kept making trouble. Nasty business, that," the first man muttered. "The boss is pushing too hard on this one. Girl's got half the town feeling sorry for her now." "Keep those thoughts to yourself if you want to keep your job," his companion warned. "Come on, finish your round so we can get back to that poker game." The lantern light receded, and the door closed with a soft click. Jake and Abigail remained motionless for several long minutes, listening as the footsteps faded down the hallway and the house settled back into silence. "That was close," Jake whispered. "We need to move now, while they're distracted with their game." They slipped out through the window, closing it carefully behind them. The return journey through the creek bed and across the open country toward Lovelock was tense but uneventful. By the time they reached the outskirts of town, the eastern sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. "We did it," Abigail said, clutching the precious ledger and letters. "I can't believe we actually did it." Jake's smile was genuine but cautious. "This is just the beginning, Miss Lawson. Now we need to see what evidence these contain and prepare our case for the federal marshal." They slipped into the schoolhouse just as the first roosters began to crow across town. Exhausted but exhilarated, Abigail placed her father's ledger and the letters on the small table. "I should try to get some rest before the children arrive," she said reluctantly, not wanting to delay examining their hard-won evidence. "You should," Jake agreed. "I'll keep watch and wake you in time. We'll go through these together when you've had some sleep." Abigail hesitated, then impulsively reached out and squeezed his hand. "Thank you, Mr. Quinn, not just for tonight but for believing me when no one else would." His fingers tightened briefly around hers, the contact sending an unexpected warmth through her tired body. "Get some rest, Miss Lawson. Tomorrow is going to be a very important day." The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity. Abigail continued teaching during the day, maintaining a facade of normalcy while Jake worked behind the scenes, gathering statements from townspeople and studying Samuel Lawson's meticulous records. The ledger proved to be even more valuable than they had hoped. Samuel had documented every interaction with Harrington over the years, including detailed accounts of escalating threats in the weeks before his death. Most damning of all were entries describing symptoms of illness after sharing a drink with one of Harrington's men's symptoms that matched those of arsenic poisoning. "Your father knew," Jake said gravely as they reviewed the final entries one evening. He suspected he was being poisoned, but by then it was too late. Abigail's hands trembled as she touched her father's familiar handwriting. "He was trying to document everything for me. He knew Harrington would come after the ranch if something happened to him." The letters from Harrington himself were equally incriminating, containing thinly veiled threats and references to unfortunate accidents that had befallen other ranchers who had refused to sell their water rights. "With this evidence and the testimonies we've gathered," Jake said, "I believe we have enough to convince the federal marshal to take action. He's expected to arrive tomorrow." Word of their investigation had spread throughout Lovelock, impossible to contain in a town of its size. Harrington had been notably absent since their confrontation in the trading post, but his influence was still felt. Several townspeople who had initially agreed to testify had withdrawn their support after receiving midnight visits from Harrington's men. Others, however, had stood firm, emboldened by Jake's presence and Abigail's unwavering determination. That evening, as they prepared their case for presentation to the marshal, Jake seemed unusually pensive. They were sitting in Eliza Barnes' restaurant after closing, papers spread across the table between them. "You've been quiet tonight," Abigail observed, studying his face in the lamplight. Jake looked up, his blue eyes troubled. "I've been thinking about what happens next. After we present our case to the marshal, I suppose there will be an investigation, possibly a trial, I mean for you," Jake clarified. "Assuming we succeed and you reclaim your father's ranch. What then?" The question caught Abigail off guard. She had been so focused on seeking justice that she hadn't allowed herself to think beyond it. "I suppose I'll continue teaching," she said slowly, "and try to run the ranch as best I can. It won't be easy without my father, but I grew up learning every aspect of ranching. I can manage with perhaps some hired help." Jake nodded, his expression unreadable. "You're a remarkable woman, Abigail Lawson." It was the first time he had called her by her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice sent a flutter through her chest. "What about you?" she asked, suddenly needing to know. "Once this is over, will you move on? Continue your travels?" He was silent for a long moment, his fingers absently tracing patterns on the wooden tabletop. "I've been drifting for a long time. Too long, maybe. Never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots." "Why is that?" Abigail asked softly. Jake's eyes met hers, and in them she saw a vulnerability he had kept carefully hidden. "After the war, after what I'd seen and done, I didn't think I deserved roots or peace. So I kept moving, taking odd jobs, working cattle drives, sometimes hiring out my gun to people who needed protection." "Is that what brought you to Lovelock?" He shook his head. "No, I was just passing through on my way to California. But then I saw you in that trading post, standing alone against all those men, tears on your face but fire in your eyes." A small smile touched his lips, and something told me I needed to stay. The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken possibilities. Abigail was acutely aware of the closeness of his hand to hers on the table, of the way the lamplight caught in his beard and softened the scar along his jaw. "I'm glad you did," she said simply. Before Jake could respond, the restaurant door burst open. Sheriff Dawson stood in the doorway, his face grave. "Quinn," he said urgently, "Harrington knows. One of his men must have overheard something at the trading post. They're saying you broke into the Lawson ranch and stole property." Jake rose to his feet. "We took nothing that didn't rightfully belong to Miss Lawson." "Doesn't matter," the sheriff said. "Harrington's gathered about a dozen men. They're combing the town looking for you both, and they're not interested in having a civilized conversation." Abigail clutched the ledger protectively. "The federal marshal arrives tomorrow. We just need to avoid them until then." Sheriff Dawson shook his head. "Harrington knows about the marshal too. That's why he's moved up his timetable. He means to deal with you tonight before the law arrives." Jake's expression hardened. "Where are they now?" "Last I saw, searching the saloon and the hotel, but they'll be here soon enough. Everyone knows you two have been spending time at Eliza's." Jake made a swift decision. "We need to get out of town. Is there somewhere safe we can go until morning?" Dawson hesitated, then nodded. "My brother has a small cabin about 5 miles west of town. It's isolated, hard to find if you don't know where to look. You could hole up there until the marshal arrives." "Can we trust you, Sheriff?" Abigail asked bluntly. "You've been Harrington's man for years." The sheriff had the grace to look ashamed. "I've made mistakes, Miss Lawson, looked the other way when I shouldn't have, but I draw the line at murder, which is what Harrington seems to have in mind tonight." Jake studied the older man's face, then nodded. "We'll need horses." "Already taken care of," Dawson said. "They're waiting in the alley behind the restaurant. I brought your saddlebags from the Hotel Quinn." "Thank you," Jake said, gathering the papers quickly and securing them in a leather portfolio. "We're in your debt, Sheriff." "Just make sure that Marshall sees those documents," Dawson replied grimly. "It's time Harrington answered for what he's done to this town." They slipped out through the restaurant's back door into the dark alley where 2 saddled horses waited. Jake helped Abigail mount, then swung up onto his own horse. "Stay close to me," he instructed as they urged the horses into motion. "And if anything happens, your priority is to get these documents to the marshal, understand?" Abigail nodded, clutching the portfolio tightly as they rode out of town under the cover of darkness. The night was clear, stars scattered like diamonds across the vast Nevada sky. They kept to the shadows wherever possible, avoiding the main road in favor of less traveled paths that wound through the sagebrush and rocky terrain. After about an hour of hard riding, they reached a small valley nestled between 2 ridges. A humble cabin stood at its center, smoke curling from the chimney. "Someone's there," Abigail whispered as they reined in their horses at the edge of the trees. "Stay here," Jake said, drawing his pistol. "I'll check it out." He dismounted and moved silently toward the cabin, keeping to the shadows. Abigail watched anxiously as he approached the door, weapon at the ready. He knocked, then stepped quickly to the side, his back against the wall as the door opened. A brief conversation followed, too distant for Abigail to hear. Then Jake motioned for her to join him. She rode forward, leading his horse behind her. An elderly man with a white beard stood in the doorway, a shotgun held loosely in his hands. "You must be the school teacher," he said as she approached. "I'm Ezra Dawson. My brother said you might be coming. Best get inside quick." The cabin was small but comfortable, warmed by a crackling fire in the stone hearth. A pot of coffee simmered on the cast iron stove, filling the air with its rich aroma. "Sheriff sent a boy ahead to let me know," Ezra explained as they settled inside. "Said you folks were in some trouble with Theodore Harrington." "That's putting it mildly," Jake replied, accepting a cup of coffee. "Thank you for taking us in. It should only be for tonight." Ezra waved away his thanks. "Any enemy of Harrington's is a friend of mine. That man drove me off my claim 10 years ago, been living out here ever since." As the night deepened, Ezra retired to a small back room, leaving Jake and Abigail alone by the fire. They sat side by side on a rough-hewn bench, the portfolio of evidence on the table before them. "You think we'll be safe here?" Abigail asked, her voice low. Jake nodded. "Harrington won't know to look here. And even if he suspects the sheriff helped us, he'd have to search a lot of territory to find this place before morning." They fell into a comfortable silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the soft whisper of wind around the cabin's eaves. Abigail found herself acutely aware of Jake beside her, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the subtle scent of leather and open air that seemed to cling to him. "Jake," she said softly, the use of his first name feeling both strange and right on her lips. "When this is over, what will you do?" He turned to look at her, the firelight casting shadows across his face. "I've been thinking about that a lot these past few days." And his eyes searched hers. "For the first time in years, I'm considering staying in one place, if there's a reason to stay." Abigail's heart quickened. "What kind of reason would be enough?" Jake reached out slowly, his calloused fingers gentle as they brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Someone worth building a future with. Someone brave and principled and stubborn enough to stand up to an entire town when necessary." The air between them seemed charged with possibility. Abigail leaned slightly toward him, drawn by a force as inevitable as gravity. "I could use help running the ranch," she whispered. "Once it's mine again." A smile touched his lips. "Is that a job offer, Miss Lawson?" "Maybe it's more than that, Mr. Quinn." His hand cupped her cheek, thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "Abigail," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm not an easy man. I've got darkness in my past, things I've done that I'm not proud of." "We all have shadows, Jake," she replied softly. "But we don't have to face them alone." The kiss, when it came, was gentle at first, tentative, questioning then deepening as Abigail's arms slipped around his neck, drawing him closer. His hands were warm against her back, strong yet tender as they held her as if she were something precious. When they finally parted, both breathless, Jake rested his forehead against hers. "I never expected to find you," he said softly. "Not in Lovelock. Not anywhere." Abigail smiled, her heart full to bursting. "Sometimes the best things find us when we're not looking for them." They spent the remainder of the night talking in low voices, sharing stories of their pasts and cautious hopes for the future. As dawn approached, they prepared to return to Lovelock to meet the federal marshal, their resolve strengthened by the bond that had formed between them. The ride back to town was tense but uneventful. They approached from the west, keeping to the cover of trees and ridgelines as much as possible. As they crested the final hill overlooking Lovelock, they saw an unusual amount of activity in the normally quiet streets. "Something's happening," Jake observed, reining in his horse. Abigail shaded her eyes against the morning sun. "Is that a federal wagon?" Indeed, parked in front of the sheriff's office was an official-looking wagon, marked with the insignia of the U.S. Marshals Service. Several men in uniform moved purposefully around it, and a small crowd had gathered to watch. "The marshal must have arrived early," Jake said. "This might work in our favor. Harrington won't risk open violence with federal authorities present." They rode cautiously into town, attracting curious stares from townspeople who had clearly heard about the previous night's events. As they approached the sheriff's office, a tall man in a marshal's uniform stepped out onto the boardwalk, accompanied by Sheriff Dawson. "Miss Lawson," Sheriff Dawson called, waving them over. "Marshal Bennett just arrived. I was just telling him about your situation." They dismounted and approached the federal officer. Marshal Bennett was an imposing figure over 6 feet tall with a neatly trimmed mustache and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "Miss Lawson," he said, tipping his hat. Sheriff Dawson has given me a brief account of your allegations against Mr. Harrington. I understand you have documentation. Abigail handed him the portfolio. My father's ledger and correspondence, sir, along with letters from Mr. Harrington himself that I believe establish his motive for murder. The marshal took the documents with a nod. I'll review these immediately. In the meantime, I suggest you both remain in the sheriff's office. Mr. Harrington and his men have been quite active in town this morning, and I'd prefer to avoid any confrontation until I've assessed the evidence. They followed Marshal Bennett and Sheriff Dawson into the office, where they found several deputy marshals already present, creating an atmosphere of official authority that had been sorely lacking in Lovelock. The marshal sat at the sheriff's desk and began methodically reviewing the documents, his expression growing more grave with each page. After nearly an hour of silent reading, he looked up. "Miss Lawson," he said, "based on these records and the corroborating statements Sheriff Dawson has collected, I believe there is sufficient evidence to arrest Theodore Harrington on suspicion of murder, fraud, and various other crimes." He turned to one of his deputies. "Michaels, take 4 men and locate Mr. Harrington. Bring him in for questioning." "Yes, sir," the deputy replied, motioning to several of his colleagues to follow him. "What about Miss Lawson's property?" Jake asked. "Harrington's men are still occupying it." Marshal Bennett nodded. "Once Harrington is in custody, we'll secure the ranch and begin the process of returning it to its rightful owner. Given the evidence of forgery in the alleged gambling debt, I don't anticipate any legal obstacles to Miss Lawson reclaiming her property." Relief washed over Abigail, so powerful that her knees nearly buckled. Jake's steady hand at her elbow kept her upright. "Thank you, Marshal," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "My father would be grateful for your thoroughness." The wait for Deputy Michaels to return with Harrington was tense. Sheriff Dawson paced nervously, clearly uncomfortable with his role in bringing down the man who had effectively ruled Lovelock for years. Jake stayed close to Abigail, his presence a steady comfort in the uncertainty. Nearly 2 hours passed before a commotion outside announced the deputy's return. The door burst open, and Theodore Harrington was led in, his hands shackled before him and his face dark with fury. "This is outrageous," he snarled, his eyes locking onto Abigail with naked hatred. "These are baseless accusations from a hysterical woman and a drifter with no standing in this community." Marshal Bennett rose from behind the desk. "Mr. Harrington, you are being detained on suspicion of multiple serious crimes, including the murder of Samuel Lawson. I have reviewed substantial evidence that contradicts your claims about acquiring his property." "Evidence?" Harrington scoffed. "What evidence could this girl possibly have? Her father's detailed records, for one," the marshal replied evenly, "along with your own letters threatening him, and statements from several townspeople regarding your methods of acquiring property." Harrington's face paled slightly, but his defiance didn't waver. "This is a conspiracy to rob me of what's rightfully mine." "I'll have my lawyers save it for the judge in Carson City," Marshal Bennett interrupted. "You'll be transported there tomorrow to face formal charges." He turned to his deputies. "Take him to the jail cell and post a guard." As Harrington was led away, still protesting loudly, Marshal Bennett returned his attention to Abigail and Jake. "Miss Lawson, I've sent men to secure your father's ranch. You should be able to return there safely by this afternoon. In the meantime, I'd like to take formal statements from both of you for the official record." The next few hours were consumed with giving detailed accounts of everything that had transpired since Samuel Lawson's death. Abigail recounted her father's concerns before his death, the circumstances upon her return to Lovelock, and the systematic way the town had dismissed her accusations. Jake described his observations and the evidence they had gathered, careful to note which townspeople had provided corroborating information. By mid-afternoon, word had spread throughout Lovelock that Harrington was in custody and Abigail Lawson would be returning to her family ranch. A crowd gathered outside the sheriff's office, not in protest, but in support townspeople who had been too afraid to speak up, before now coming forward to offer assistance and express their regret for not believing her earlier. As Abigail and Jake prepared to ride to the ranch, escorted by 2 deputy marshals, Abigail felt a strange mix of emotions: joy at reclaiming her home, grief for her father who hadn't lived to see justice done, and a nervous anticipation about what the future might hold with Jake at her side. "Are you ready?" Jake asked softly as he helped her mount her horse. Abigail nodded, looking out at the townspeople who had gathered to see them off. Many of the same faces that had turned away from her tears now looked at her with respect and, in some cases, admiration. "I think I am," she replied. "Thanks to you." The ride to the ranch was filled with a sense of homecoming that brought fresh tears to Abigail's eyes, tears of relief and healing rather than the bitter tears of injustice she had shed for so long. As they approached the main house, she saw Harrington's men being escorted off the property by the marshals who had arrived earlier. When they reached the house, Abigail dismounted slowly, taking in the familiar sight of her childhood home with new eyes. It would need work. Harrington's occupation had not been kind to the property, but it was still the place where she had grown up, still filled with memories of her father. Jake stood beside her, a respectful distance between them as she processed her emotions. "Welcome home, Abigail," he said quietly. She turned to him, her heart full. "It doesn't feel quite real yet." "It will," he assured her, "day by day." The deputy marshals informed them that they would maintain a presence on the property overnight, both to ensure Abigail's safety and to complete an inventory of items that might serve as evidence in Harrington's trial. They set up camp near the barn, giving Abigail and Jake privacy as they entered the house. Inside, Abigail moved from room to room, reacquainting herself with the space, noting what had been changed or damaged during Harrington's occupation. Her father's study had been ransacked, likely in search of the very documents they had recovered. The kitchen was a mess, and several pieces of furniture were missing or broken. "It's going to take time to set things right," she said, running her hand along the mantelpiece where her family pictures had once stood. "You have time now," Jake replied, "and you won't be doing it alone." She turned to face him, her heart quickening at the implication in his words. "Jake, I know we've only known each other a short while, but these past days, they've changed me, changed how I see my future." He moved closer, taking her hands in his. "They've changed me too, Abigail. For years I've been running from one place to the next, never letting myself get attached. But from the moment I saw you standing alone in that trading post, something inside me knew I was done running." "What are you saying?" she asked, though her heart already knew the answer. "I'm saying that if you'll have me, I'd like to stay, help you rebuild this place, build a life here with you." His blue eyes were earnest, vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before. "I know it's fast, and I know you have every reason to be cautious, but I also know that some things don't need years to become certain. Some things you just know." Abigail's smile bloomed slowly, like the desert flowers after a rare rain. "I know too, Jake. I've known since that night in Ezra's cabin, maybe even before." He pulled her gently into his arms, his kiss a promise of all that lay ahead, challenges they would face together, a home they would rebuild, a life they would share. In the months that followed, Lovelock underwent a transformation. With Harrington's grip on the town broken, people began to speak more freely, to cooperate more willingly, to build the community they had always wanted but had been too afraid to create under his shadow. Harrington himself was convicted on multiple charges, including the murder of Samuel Lawson. The evidence Abigail had preserved, combined with testimony from townspeople and even some of Harrington's own men who turned against him to save themselves, proved overwhelming. He was sentenced to life imprisonment in the territorial prison. Abigail continued teaching at the schoolhouse, now as a respected figure in the community rather than an object of pity or scorn. Jake proved to be a natural rancher, applying the skills he had learned in his years of drifting to rebuild the Lawson property into a thriving operation. Their wedding, held 6 months after their first meeting, drew attendance from the entire town. Sheriff Dawson, now dedicated to upholding the law impartially, gave Abigail away in her father's absence. Ezra Dawson played the fiddle for their first dance. Even Marshall Bennett returned from Carson City for the occasion, bringing news that the territorial governor had appointed a new judge to replace the one who had been in Harrington's pocket. As Abigail and Jake stood before the town that had once turned a blind eye to her tears, exchanging vows to love and protect each other for the rest of their lives, she felt her father's presence as surely as if he stood beside her. He would have approved of Jake. She knew a man of principle and courage, who had made an entire town look injustice in the eye and recognize it for what it was. That evening, as they sat on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the Nevada sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jake took her hand and pressed a gentle kiss to her palm. "Happy?" he asked, his voice low and intimate in the gathering dusk. Abigail leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the solid strength of him beside her. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied truthfully. "You gave me back my home, Jake, but more than that, you gave me a future when all I could see was the past." "We gave each other a future," he corrected gently. "That's the gift of not having to stand alone anymore." As darkness settled over the land that had seen so much strife and, finally, justice, Abigail Lawson Quinn knew with absolute certainty that her tears had not been in vain. They had brought her this man, this life, this second chance at happiness. And in the years to come, any tears she shed would be witnessed, acknowledged, and respected not just by the one man who had believed her from the start, but by an entire community that had learned the power of looking truth directly in the eye. 5 years later, the Lawson Quinn Ranch had become one of the most prosperous in the region. The main house had been fully restored and expanded to accommodate their growing family, 3-year-old Samuel, named for Abigail's father, and 1-year-old Elizabeth, whose bright blue eyes matched her father's exactly. Abigail still taught at the schoolhouse 3 days a week, having trained a young woman from Carson City to assist her with the growing number of students. Jake had established himself as a respected rancher and community leader, often consulted by neighboring towns facing challenges similar to those Lovelock had overcome. The town itself had flourished once freed from Harrington's control. New businesses had opened, families had moved in, and a small church had been built on land donated by the Quinns. Sheriff Dawson had retired, replaced by a younger man committed to equal justice for all citizens. The days when a woman's tears could be dismissed and her truth ignored seemed like a distant memory. On the anniversary of the day Jake had first ridden into town, he and Abigail stood together on the porch of their home, watching their children play in the yard while the sun set behind the mountains. "You ever regret it?" Abigail asked, leaning against her husband's solid frame. "Settling down with a stubborn schoolteacher when you could have kept exploring the frontier," Jake's arm tightened around her waist as he pressed a kiss to her temple. "Not for a single moment," he replied with quiet certainty. "I found everything I never knew I was looking for right here in Lovelock, Nevada." Abigail smiled, thinking of the long, unlikely path that had brought them together, a path paved with tears that had finally been seen and acknowledged, leading to a love that had transformed not just two lives but an entire community. "I'm glad you made them look me in the eye," she said softly. Jake's low chuckle rumbled against her. "They just needed to be reminded of who they really were," he said. "Good people who'd lost their way for a while." As their children's laughter floated on the evening breeze, Abigail Quinn knew that the legacy of those difficult days would live on, not just in the justice that had been served, but in the community that had found its conscience, in the family they had built, and in the love that had begun with one man willing to believe a woman's tears when no one else would.